Hi guys, welcome to Bible Breeze, the channel for a fresh breeze on the pages of your Bible. We are looking at the book of Jonah, and in this session we want to look at the questions of authorship and date, and they are actually not so easy to answer. Because as we will see, the book of Jonah is actually completely anonymous and undated. We don't have an author that tells his name at the beginning of the book like Paul does or some of the other prophets. We don't hear when it was written. What we know is that the book is written in the third person, so it's possible that not Jonah wrote it himself. It's unlikely. Moses, Isaiah, and Daniel, they used the third person as well, but generally the prophets wrote in the first person. So if Jonah did write the book, then actually the sailors must have told him what happened while he was asleep, or they must have told him what happened after he was thrown into the sea. As long as how long was he in the belly of the whale? All these things we don't know. Dating proposals range actually between 750 BC and 250 BC, so that's quite a long range. The book of Jonah is mentioned in Ecclesiasticus 49:10. That's a book that was written shortly after 200 BC, so we know that by then the book must have existed. There are a number of reasons why the dating goes so far apart, and I want to quickly go through them. Depending on how much you're interested into this, you can also look into more specific literature. There are some linguistic features. Scholars have dated the book after the exile, so the 5th or the 4th century, based on linguistic features like late biblical Hebrew and Aramisms. This is a really complex issue to discuss it here, and I don't even understand it that much. But it could also be a northern Israelite dialect which differed from classical Hebrew. In this case, the book could have been written earlier, like prior to the 6th century, maybe even in the 8th. There are some legendary descriptions, or you could say historic inaccuracies, which make people doubt the writing date. Some say it must have been written after the destruction of Nineveh in 612, at the time when the knowledge of the city was greatly influenced by legendary descriptions. It was like this amazing, and so they say this exaggerated size of the city, like 3 days, and the exaggerated population, 120,000 people, that's more like popular tradition later on and not historical fact. So it must have happened a long time after that, or definitely after the destruction. A similar position is adopted by people who say the title King of Nineveh, that never occurs in any Assyrian annals and any documents there. We also have this comment that Nineveh was a very important city, and that could mean it's no longer, so it must have already been fallen. Also, we don't know who this King of Nineveh is. We should know this if it's a timely record. Some people say that in the book there are certain customs that fit more to the late Persian period, like post-exilic period, and they were unknown in 8th century Assyria. For example, that a decree is issued by the king and his nobles. Didn't happen earlier, or the participation of animals in a religious fast. So on these observations, people say it's probably a post-exilic date. It was written long after, or it was written after the exile. So what do we do with this? Let's talk about some of these issues. Sorry. The size of Nineveh. It's talked about Nineveh as a 3 days journey that could be about 60 miles, and many have said that's a gross exaggeration. When you say a day's journey is, let's say, 20 miles, that would make Nineveh 60 miles wide or 60 miles in circumference. And we know from a contemporary document that the early 7th century Assyrian king Sennacherib He enlarged actually the circumference of the city from 9,300 cubits, that is 3 miles, to approximately 7 miles. But that was the enlargement. So this is really, this is not possible. Prior to the end of the 8th century, Nineveh was probably not even more than a mile across at its widest. So that is very unlikely. But what could be is in Genesis 10 we read about Nimrod, how he built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, Rezin, which is between Nineveh and Calah, and he says that is the great city. So could it be a larger district? Maybe. Would that work? But the problem is that this text described Nineveh as a city, not as a whole district. And Jonah goes into the city, a day's journey. He's sitting outside of the city. So again, it's unclear if it refers to an actual place. We don't know how that is possible. If it refers to the whole district, the language doesn't seem to care so much, it seems. What do we do about the population of Nineveh? If the last comment that there are 120,000 people who don't know right from right and left, if that would refer to children, meaning they are still innocent, then 100,000 people could be even 600,000 people, and this is way more than could have lived within the walls of Nineveh. Both numbers, 120,000 could maybe have lived in greater Nineveh if we say it's this, all of these locations, these 4 cities or the whole district together. When it says Nineveh was a very important city, I think we shouldn't overinterpret. The whole report is written in past tense, so everything was. I mean, then Jonah would have been dead by the time it was written, and everybody else. So I wouldn't put too much into this. Then we have the story about the king of Nineveh. It's unattested that there has ever been a king of Nineveh. The Assyrian rulers have usually been called king of Assyria. Now, Nineveh became the official capital of the Assyrian Empire only after Sennacherib in 705-682 BC. But it has always been one of the most important cities in Assyria, and it could have been a temporal residence for the rulers nevertheless. But this should suggest that the title was invented at a time when the knowledge of the Assyrian Empire was very limited and remote. But if we assume a late date of composition, the author probably drew upon the Book of Kings for his choice of prophet, and that it's not it's not strange that he also drew upon the same work for information concerning the Assyrians. So I don't know what we should do with this. Kings sometimes were actually only designated by one city within the region that they ruled. So we also have that in Kings when it actually talks about Sihon, the king of the Amorites, or the king of Heshbon, or Ahab is once called king of Samaria, even though he is king of all of Israel. So maybe that is a similar situation that we find in the book there. It could also possibly accurately reflect the political situation of the time of Jonah, meaning that the king had very limited control over a region and only control over a region that centered around Nineveh, because the Assyrian Empire might not have been that strong around that time. And it was towards the end of the 8th century that the Assyrian Empire re-emerged as a major world power, but it had a really weak phase before. And then we have the late customs that are typical of the later Persian period, like the kings and his nobles. So during a time of extreme crisis, for example, a solar eclipse or so, it was not unknown that a king was replaced by a substitute king until the time of danger had passed. That could have been the place. It could also have been because of the political situation in the 8th century. There were very weak kings and very powerful provincial governors around at that time. So consequently, the head of the Assyrian dynasty found it necessary to issue a decree together with his nobles. That might be. There are other considerations as well when it comes to the time and the dating. Some people could have been borrowed. We read that many of the texts that we have in Jonah refer to other parts of Scripture, and the question is who has borrowed from whom, which was written first, which was written later, and that of course then depends on how you date the other books that might be referred to. We have lots of passages from the rest of the Tanakh. We have very interesting parallels with the book of Joel when it talks about the character of God, who is relenting or not. So that might be an indication when Jonah was written, but again, we don't know who borrowed from whom. It seems that the book of Jonah actually is referring to the exile. It's comparing Jonah to Israel being gone, being away, being captive in the fish under the sea, but then coming back out again and still having a call, still having a mission. So Jonah's imprisonment in the fish could represent the Babylonian captivity. But wasn't the captivity negative, actually? And the fish appears in connection with a storm. The storm was an instrument of God's judgment or discipline, but the fish actually preserved Jonah's existence and call from vanishing in the ocean. But so Babylon also kind of preserved the tribe of Judah from vanishing in the nations, like the northern tribes did after the Assyrian Empire took them away. So that could be an indication as well. The majority of recent writers on Jonah favor an exilic or post-exilic date for the composition of the book. That would of course mean Jonah cannot have written it. And the linguistic evidence could also, it doesn't exclude an earlier date. So we don't know exactly when it has been written. Some people suggest that Jonah has been included in the minor prophets to bring the number to 12, because 12 is like a really cool number if you want to have books in the Bible. In the Hebrew Bible, some think it's a combination of the length and the date and the subject that it has been included. But Jonah has become part of the Hebrew canon, and it must have been sufficiently early enough in order to not be counted among the writings. So it is maybe very likely that it has been written around the exile. I think it was definitely written after Kings and some of the other books, but we will come to that, and we will come to some of the reasons for this. In the next section, I would like to look together with you a little bit at the historical background of Jonah, the time when it should play. What was actually going on there? How did the world empires look like? But what has been happened also in the story of God and his people so far? It's really interesting. You don't want to miss it. And I'm looking forward to see you in the next Bible Breeze episode. Subscribe and then you won't miss it for sure. Bye-bye.